Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. As you can hear by my voice, we are still in John's recovering from a cold era. This is a podcast that sums up around 10 years of my autism and Christianity research, covering around 26,000 autistic Christians and ex-Christians that I found online, and doing over 500 interviews with Christians and ex-Christians to ask them, hey, what's going on? And throughout my travels, I have had a lot of people ask me questions like, how should I think about hermeneutics? How do I read this part of the Bible? How do I reconcile X and Y? How do I think about Paul? I'm really struggling with Paul. Help, I'm struggling with Paul. Can you do a podcast about Paul? John, how do you read Paul? Is Paul bad? Is Paul good? I get lots of questions like that. And I'm not a theologian by any stretch of the imagination. Every time I attempt to do theology, I'm really bad at it. So I always tell people, don't go to me. I'm not your guy. I am a computer engineer who specializes in cybersecurity, not a theologian. Go to a theologian for this. But nevertheless, people want to know what has worked for other autistic people. Like, what do autistic people find in Paul and like about Paul? And I will say there is no single solution for this. Autistic people are a heterogeneous population with many different opinions on many different places in Paul. And over the last 10 years of helping people, I have basically found that there is no one size fits all solution. There's nothing that's going to singularly stick. And the best solution is to sort of throw spaghetti at the wall and see if something sticks. And for those of you who don't know what that expression means, just read a bunch of stuff from a bunch of different perspectives and see if any of it starts to resonate or starts to work. And one type of thinking about Paul that I found, a piece of spaghetti that it tends to be particularly or statistically significantly more sticky than the other pieces of spaghetti in this metaphor, is the work of a professor from Duke named Douglas Campbell. So I first encountered him in 2014 when, after reading the Anchor Bible Commentary on Galatians by J. Louis Martin, and I read it and I thought, wow, this is so cool. I wonder if anyone else thought this was really cool. I was also really into Karl Barth. Again, as an atheist, this was a bit weird for me. So I was reading through Church Dogmatics at the time as well. And I thought, wow, I wish someone took what Martin was doing and expanded it beyond Galatians and sort of into a holistic reading of Paul. Surely I'm not the only one who's had this thought. And sure enough, I was not the only one who had this thought, especially within the other community of Barth appreciators that were on Facebook at the time. And so through that, I found Douglas Campbell's work, The Deliverance of God. It is a bit of a book stop, or sorry, it's a bit of a doorstop, I will admit. A lot of people ask me, like, oh, you really like Douglas Campbell. Where should I start? Should I start on The Deliverance of God? And I go, no, you should not do that. I wouldn't recommend any normal person attempt to read this book. It is a complex, multidisciplinary book that requires you to at least be somewhat conversant in ancient languages, philosophy, and a whole bunch of other threads to tie them together. It is not an easy read. It took me quite a while to get through, and it's pretty brutal. And I often wished that there was a accessible version of that book that took all the important parts and sort of synthesized it down to its key components and made it accessible to a lay reader. And what do you know? That's been done, and it has been done by my podcast guest, Jon De Pue. John, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm John. I'm the other John, I guess, on this
Yes,
podcast today.
you're being double Johned.
Double John today. Yeah. Well, I'm Jon De Pue. I I don't even know how to introduce myself. Really, I'm a
So you
guy
used to be a
who
student of Douglas Campbell?
I am a guy who has been influenced very deeply by Doug Campbell's work and him as a person in particular. But that's because I went to Duke to do my MDiv. I was providentially uh, assigned as one of his advisees at Duke, and I had read that there's a little chapter that he wrote in Four Views on Paul, and that there's a little Zondervan collection there. I read that in undergrad when I was doing my degree in religion and philosophy. I was taking a Paul class, read that. I was already into Bart, as you were saying. So praise Bart. And
Bart Squad.
I'm kidding. But yeah, I was super into Bart at that time, and also like a bunch of other kind of reform thinkers at the time, the Torrances as well. And then I came across this reading of Paul that was like doing the same kind of stuff. And it was like, this is really, really cool. And at that time, I was just trying to figure out during my undergrad education, I was just trying to figure out like what I wanted to do. And my academic advisor at my college was a Duke graduate and gently kind of pushed me to go to Duke. And I was like, okay, I'll apply. And I applied, got in. And then Doug was assigned as my advisor. I kind of, as we talk about jokingly, but also I think there's a seriousness here. I've kind of just followed him around and stalked him for 3 years, and kind of coerced him into being my friend along the way. And I feel like I have a degree in Douglas Campbell's studies more than I do a degree in divinity, I guess, which apparently is what the MDiv degree is. But yeah, got to know Doug, took a bunch of classes with him, way too many, and started to see, as you were saying, about the deliverance of God, because I had read that as well and continued to read it, continued to go back to that text, and was like, I love this stuff. I wish there was a way to make this more clear to people, because
Yeah.
I think it's good. I think it's really, really important. And there needs to be a way to actually make this clear to people. And so once I graduated from Duke and started working in kind of Christian education settings in various churches, mainline Protestant churches, which I am a Christian. I should say that as well. I'm a Christian. I'm a mainline Protestant. I was like, hang on, can we actually do this? Can we actually write this book, this kind of condensed version of the good stuff from Deliverance of God for people who don't have the time to read Deliverance? They don't have the time to go through, 1,000 pages. Can we actually condense this down? And having worked in Christian ed settings, and also I worked a lot with like teens and children. Like I have this I had that kind of brain of like condensing things down, like making it much more plain. And I talked to Doug about that, and he was like, okay, you might as well pitch it to a publishing company. And I was like, okay, I can do that. So I wrote up a pitch to Whipped and Stock / Cascade. And they were like, cool, this sounds great. You need Doug to sign off on it, though. And Doug was like, okay, I guess I'll be your co-author in this. And we started writing, or I started writing it. Obviously, Doug's much more busy than I am, especially he was at the time. So I just started going for it, just trying to make this plain. And so I would send him chapters or sections of chapters and kind of go through it and condense things down a bit more. Just trying to like, it's difficult to co-write with people, right? Because we have our own kind of styles of writing. So it's difficult to kind of like make it seem like it's a single author. It's very hard. That took the most time, I think, was trying to make that smooth, right? But eventually we got to the point where the manuscript seemed really solid. And we were like, okay, this is great. Let's send it off. And thankfully, it's not 1,000 pages. It's what, 260 pages, 250 ish. Yeah.
which is significantly more reasonable. And
Yeah, it's also written
and
in a way that's a bit
yeah,
easier
also
to
written more
digest.
accessibly.
Yeah.
Having read the two, I will say,
Yeah.
there is one I would recommend people read, and there is
Yeah.
one I would only recommend you
Yeah.
read if I think you're a freak.
Yeah,
So
that's right. You would be surprised how many people actually do read Deliverance, like everyday people, and actually come
I
away with like, okay, this actually does make sense. What you're actually putting forward,
yes,
like regardless of the sort of interdisciplinary stuff that he's doing. I mean, he goes so much into like semiotics, linguistics. He goes so much into areas of philosophy that like most people don't know. But for some reason, that book actually landed with certain people, but I wanted it to land with more everyday people than
yes,
was happening,
yes.
right? And it didn't land with the Academy at all. If you read the reviews of Deliverance, it's just like, my gosh.
Yeah, so
Uh,
I I always like mention that I like Douglas Campbell just to see how people react, and it's always an interesting thing. However, I can fall back on the excuse, look, I'm just a computer engineer. I don't know what
yeah.
I'm talking about. And then immediately they go, "Oh yeah, that's right. You're dumb. You can you're allowed to have these opinions." But yeah, he's one of those guys who like in the academy, you either really like him or you have some issues. And
Yeah, that's true.
yeah,
Um,
and I'm in the I really like him category, and I mean I
Me
think a lot of
too,
people who are in the I really like him category are
obviously.
also sort of Bart pilled.
Bart Pilled is that's a great way of talking about it. Yeah, and also like it's what Doug is doing is not specifically just simply going back to Bart. Like
Yeah.
he's drawing from a bunch of other
Oh
traditions,
yeah.
especially like he goes kind of Pentecostal in certain ways. He goes kind of
Yep.
like Eastern Orthodox in certain ways. He goes kind of Catholic via
Pulling from
power loss in
Irenaeus
certain
and in
ways.
other
Like
places.
yeah, and Irenaeus. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
it's not this kind of one thing, but yeah, you're more prepped to understand what Doug is doing if you have some familiarity with like somebody like Bart, somebody like the Torrances in particular, especially JB Torrance.
Yep.
I think if you can get what JB is doing, that's really what kicked off what he was doing with Deliverance, covenant versus contract stuff, which I'm sure we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So basically, this book, as I explain it, this is deliverance of God for normal people. Um, basically, basically, I think the best way to do it it's an introduction to the ideas that Douglas Campbell's trying to throw down, but in a way that
yeah,
people who don't think reading a 1,000-page book is a good use of their time
yeah,
will still be able to appreciate. I will say he does have some other accessible books, like Paul and Apostle's Journey is pretty
yeah,
accessible,
totally, yeah,
and a few more. Not Pauline Dogmatics. I don't think that one's very accessible. um,
no,
but yeah,
it's not.
yeah, yep.
It's not. It's very it's still very technical, even though
In a
it
different way,
was sort of
I would say.
yeah, but it was sort of pitched as a more accessible kind of thing, which is fine. I think that,
Yep.
but like, I don't think he'll mind me saying this. He kind of needed me to to like actually distill this stuff down. Pauline Dogmatics is still 500 pages,
I know
right?
it's still a massive book, and this is
Yeah,
his attempt to condense it,
yeah,
or to make it for popular audiences.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I often get that criticism of like my technical writing, where I write it for like I think I'm writing for a non-technical audience, and they're like, "Oh, this is a great technical paper, but where's the non-technical audience one?" I'm like, "This is the non-technical audience
Sure.
one. What are you
Yeah,
talking about?"
yeah,
Um, yeah, I I get a lot of that with my particular technical writing, so I can empathize with Doug a little bit there. So yeah, maybe let's just start with doing a brief explanation of what you're trying to do in this book, like the sort of elevator pitch for the book, I guess.
sure. Yeah, I think the main thing we're trying to do is we see in Paul, and lots of people have, that there's a certain data set in Paul that says something about God and God's relation to humans and creation that seems very different from what Paul says in another data set. One data set says that God looks at you in a particular way. The other one says that God looks at you in a very different kind of way. So the first data set, this kind of minority set of texts that we see in Paul, that again, a lot of people have already recognized, is that God looks at you in a way that's very retributive, very negative right up front. And you have to do something to sort of contract into a positive relationship with that God right up front. That's sort of the move for that data set. It's all about being justified by faith alone, really, is how it usually gets read, even though faith alone does not show up in Paul. But it usually gets read in this sort of way. So you have justification words floating around, you've got works of law words floating around, you've got faith language floating around, combined in a particular way in this data set. And then you have another data set that talks about God self-revealing and dying for you while you were still hostile to God. It's unconditional. Fundamentally, God dies for you when at the moment that you did not deserve it, that you did not deserve anything from God at that point. Anything. God dies for you in that situation, right? God is fundamentally unconditional in that way. And that actually really affects how you think about ethics, how you think about how to act in relation to other people, how you act in relation to outsiders, how you relate to God, really, and what God's really like in that situation, right? So you have these two data sets right up front. That's weird, right? So the question in the book is what to do with those two data sets in Paul. Do we bury our heads in the sand and are like, they work together fine? Do we let one override the other? What do we do here? So the book is really about trying to figure out that kind of puzzle in Paul. And the way that we do it is to start off where Paul starts off, which is, how does Paul's missionary journey kick off? It's a revelation from Jesus Christ to him, in him, however you want to translate that, in the way that he talks about it in Galatians. If you start off that way, that opens up so much more interesting stuff in terms of how to deal with these two data sets, right? If it starts with God self-revealing, and this God is working to gather up all things in Christ, all people, everything. Like there's nothing sort of outside of that. If we start there, then it's like, okay, what do we do with that 10% of material, which is the justification kind of like contractual material? It's just under 10% of what Paul actually writes in his data. What do we do with that stuff? And our solution is to basically say, okay, it doesn't sound like Paul, but what we do know contingently in Paul's letters is that there's usually a third party around, leaning on Lou Martin, as you were talking about, J. Lou Martin. There's usually another voice in the room in Paul's text. So maybe, just maybe, he's actually targeting an opponent in that 10% of material. Maybe he's doing something a bit more sophisticated than we actually thought he was doing. He's not actually laying out his gospel there, or even talking about his own positive gospel at that point. Maybe he's actually setting someone else up and showing his communities why, if someone walks through the door actually talking like this, you shouldn't listen to this person because they're actually contradicting what I've experienced, what I've actually told you already, as Paul will say in Galatians, that it's actually no gospel at all. That's the no gospel, right? So the no gospel is that 10% of material, although part of it is a kind of rhetorical walking through, showing how some of this stuff just simply devolves into absurdity. So there are some complications involved there in terms of like how to actually script this, I guess. But the whole idea is that 10% of material can be reread in a way that is rhetorically sensitive to how Paul is responding to certain problem people coming into his communities and trying to sheep steal. Is that a phrase that people use anymore? Sheep steal?
I don't know. I
I'm
think
not
it's
sure.
pretty self-explanatory, though.
Yeah. He's
Even
trying to
even if
take
you didn't
on.
know the phrase, I'm sure you could
Yeah.
put A and B together for that
Yeah,
one.
sure. But like, he's trying to respond to certain people that are coming into his communities and causing problems and actually agitating his converts, and trying to persuade them to a different kind of gospel. And Paul's very unhappy with that. So the question is like, what if this stuff, this 10% of material is actually him setting up a different person's gospel and then exposing it and showing its contradictions all the way through, especially as a missionary program for pagans or Gentiles in particular. So that's kind of what the book's about. It's trying to get in touch with the heart of Paul right up front. That's why we structure the book that way, unlike Deliverance. We don't start off just dumping on this theory. We start off by saying, this is the good stuff. This is what Paul is doing most of the time. And now when you see this other stuff in the light of that, you got to do something with it because it's saying very different things, very like fundamentally different things with God, with the person, with Jesus Christ within that, with death, resurrection, all of that, faith as well, works, all of that. So that's kind of the big elevator pitch, I guess, for this.
So this is it's the elevator in the Burj Khalifa. It's a pretty long
Yeah.
elevator. So
It's
the
an
way
ambitious book.
yeah,
It is.
it is.
Because it's trying to distill a bunch of stuff down. But
Yeah, so the way I try to explain it to people is sort of somewhat similar, but I basically say, look, if you take Paul, there are going to be different themes within Paul and various different perspectives that Paul is taking at various points in his letters to address different things. And each one of these perspectives can be thought of as like a piece of paper with a bunch of shapes cut out of it. And the order in which you layer these pieces of paper changes what the overall thing will look like in the end.
sure.
Right? The order in which you layer these things. And what Deliverance was trying to do was to say, why are we always putting this one piece of paper in front? It's blocking a
Yes.
lot of the other stuff.
Yes.
And what if Paul did not intend for this to be in front? What if Paul intended for this to be somewhere else in that layer ordered stack? And if we do that rearrangement, what are the implications of that rearrangement? And so
Yeah.
that first layer is like the justification texts. So all the texts that show what, I mean, most people, at least in the Western church, recognize as like, or at least in the Protestant side of the Western church, recognize as the gospel, which is like, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. You know, you are in this terrible predicament and you are unable to escape it.
Yeah.
You are being judged for your sins. Someone must take those sins upon themselves. Jesus did that for you. You are no longer subject to the wrath of God. And that is the way that you now read everything, because that's the first in your layer of shapes. But what Deliverance is trying to do is to say, what if the actual way that you're supposed to read through all these other themes in Paul is that starting message of the, I guess, the incarnation of Jesus Christ into the world, and the revelation of God through Jesus, and this, the good news in what happens after that. What if that's the way that you're supposed to read all the other texts? And I don't know, did I coherently read the books, or did I get that off?
Yes. No. You got it. That's, you actually just gave
Cool.
a pristine outline of like what justification theory actually does
Yeah,
with what you were saying.
I've tried this pitch several times.
Yeah. No.
Glad to know
You're
I haven't
exactly.
been leading people astray.
I would put things a bit. I would just accent what you said.
Yeah,
I think that justification theory kind of approach tends to, out of all proportion, control everything else that Paul says for a lot of people. That's the
yeah,
problem. That's the captivity that we
Yeah.
need the gospel to be liberated from. So I think you're exactly right on that. That's the issue there, is that there's a small minority set of text that it's doing so much controlling work on everything else that Paul says.
Yeah, it's like
And
part
we
of
just assume
Galatians
it's
and
the
the
case.
first 3 chapters of Romans.
I know. We just assume
Yeah.
it's the case. And I would also just kind of add on to this. It makes a certain amount of sense when you think about how Paul's letters actually are in our current Bibles that we have. It starts off with Romans, right? It's the longest letter of Paul. It starts off with Romans 1 to 3, right? So if you're just picking this up and you're like, how do I understand Paul? You're going to go to his first book. It's the biggest book. And you're going to think that Paul's just laying out the foundation of his gospel throughout Romans 1:18 through 3:20. You're just going to, that's just in your bones, right? Because you picked up this text and it's ordered in a certain particular way. But like, the canon wasn't ordered in a particular way to make sense theologically. That's not how the canon works with Paul in particular. But I actually don't think in general. You're not just supposed to read it front to back and be like, I got it. I can start here. And now I understand what Paul's doing kind of in an introductory way, or this sort of front end of his gospel. It's just assumed that we do that. We take it for granted. We have scripts going through our head from people, from teachers, from pastors, from the way that we've just been trained to read the Bible, that you just start off here and you can get everything boom, 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 chronologically all the way through, right?
Yeah.
We just assume that's going to happen. So I think that's part of it as well, is just simply the order of Paul's texts.
Hey everyone. If you're enjoying this podcast and want to support my work, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting if you're listening on YouTube, or rating and reviewing the podcast on whatever app you listen to it on. Some people have asked me if they can support my research work and podcast or encourage me to continue doing this work that many autistic people find valuable. If my work has been helpful for you and you have the means to do so, I would appreciate if you could make a single donation or sign up for recurring monthly donations to the Against Malaria Foundation. I'll provide a link in the description. This is a very effective charity that helps prevent malaria by donating bed nets to people who need them. Each net costs around $2 and lasts for 3 to 4 years and protects on average 2 people. The statistics on this are well known. Every 600 nets that are provided saves 1 child from dying of malaria, and around 500 to 1,000 cases of malaria get prevented. Every single net matters. Even if you can only make a small donation, I would greatly appreciate it, as it really helps motivate me. So far, we've already raised well over $500, and I have to say, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much to everyone who contributed. This does make a difference, and this really does help me want to continue pursuing this work. In addition, this podcast has merch. We use Teespring as a provider. I can provide a link in the description. There you can find many fun stickers that have themes that come up in this podcast, shirts, or mugs. Any of the proceeds from the merch will be donated to the Against Malaria Foundation and shared with the artists. That's all for now. Back to the podcast. Yeah.
That has done some of the damage.
And I think another thing that's worth mentioning is, like, think of the order in which the letters of Paul actually probably came out chronologically, right?
Absolutely.
Romans is probably one of the last ones, right?
100%. Yes.
It's certainly not in the front, and
No.
and we're not exactly sure where Galatians is in this whole thing, but like,
Yeah.
the reality is, when you look at Paul's texts, Romans is probably the last thing he wrote.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
in every single case, he's not writing these things sort of out of context. He's writing things to communities that have things
Yeah.
going on inside of them.
Yeah.
And we can sort of get hints to what are
No, I
going on in
know.
those communities.
That's the thing. We also forget, I do think this is an important thing to bring up. We just forget that epistles are supposed to be addressing certain, as you were saying, contingencies contingency within particular communities to address stuff that's going on with them. So Paul's not writing a systematic theology, really, ever. I think possibly with one exception, but it doesn't look like systematic theology in the way that we think about it now. He's just not doing that. He is writing usually when he can't be present with people. Letters, epistles tended to be kind of stand-ins for someone not being present. We forget this, or may not have even known that. Letters stand in for you not being present, usually. So yeah, it's not Paul just delivering some kind of fully worked out, systematic sort of thing up front. He is trying to address the contingent issues going on in particular communities all the way through. For whatever reason, we let Romans off the hook. Like in the history of scholarship, we let Romans off the hook. I've never understood that. People get into the contingency of like Galatians. People get into the contingency of the Corinthian correspondence. People get into the contingency of the Thessalonian correspondence. Like, but Romans is apparently a different thing. Why? No. Like
the reason is because when Phoebe first delivered the speech and taught the letter of Romans to the churches at Rome, she did such a good job. They were like, "Wow, this is standalone."
yeah, yeah,
That's what went on. That's my theory.
yeah.
Yeah, but so yeah, I think this is like, I don't know. I really like the books, and you've done lots of interviews across the internet where people can find you explicating more about the book if people would like to hear you talk about that. So we won't I won't force you to talk about the same thing you've talked about 100 times on 100 different podcasts. And instead, I want to bring up a subject that I think is really important and one that gets brought up to me a lot, which are sort of the critiques of this
Mm-hmm.
way of reading Paul
Sure.
and this way of reading Paul. And the first one is an open-ended question, and I'll just let you run with it. And it's sort
Okay.
of like, okay, that's great that this is how Douglas Campbell thinks we should be reading Paul, but like how did we miss it for 2000 years? Like, why did it take some random New Zealander to to figure this out 2000 years after Paul's letters were written? Why don't other Christians say this throughout church history?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple different things within this as well. I can respond to both of them, but what I'll say here initially is there is a kind of misconception on Doug simply figuring this stuff out.
Yeah.
So just suddenly, just he was Jesus showed up and revealed what
The
all
Holy
this stuff was
Spirit
about. Yeah,
revealed
yeah,
himself to Douglas Campbell speaking
yeah,
the
exactly.
words.
It's a fairly common misconception, and he's gotten this so much in the reviews of Deliverance in the past, and like it's interesting. I'll say it that way, not to be negative or positive. It is interesting, but so just thinking back, Thomas Schmeller argued a similar kind of thing way back in the believe early 20th century, late 19th. He didn't flesh it out that much. His account of Romans into 3, but then you have Kelvin Porter coming in early 90s, picking up that stuff from Schmeller, and he kind of builds on what he's doing at that point. But they're doing very similar things to what Campbell's doing already. Campbell actually did his work on Deliverance pretty much independently of these guys. He references Porter briefly in a footnote, but that's it. I don't think he actually read Porter. To be honest, I don't think he did. Otherwise, the book would look a bit different. It's just really interesting. There are plenty of scholars who have actually detected the basic contradictions within that stretch of text in Romans 1 to 3. E.B. Sanders, for example, notice this. Heikki Raisinen also picked this up. They don't actually try to solve anything, But they notice that Paul is being fundamentally contradictory within Romans 1-3. They notice that. They're just
Sort
like,
of
okay, Paul's
famously
contradictory.
difficult.
Yeah, they're just like, Paul's contradictory, which is fine. Others, J.C. O'Neill, saw the contradictions and thought that Romans 1:18 to 2:20 is a later non-Pauline interpolation. It was so contradictory that they did that. It's a later interpolation of something. So people notice this stuff in Paul, and they have for quite a while now. So it's not a surprise to me that this is happening, or that like there's no like sudden, revelation that happens and Doug does this new thing. This has been going on for a long time. People notice this stuff, if they're actually being very honest. There are more scholars than we think. I mean, Richard Hayes actually notices this stuff in Romans 1-3. He doesn't try to solve it. He thinks he has a solution, but like it doesn't really work. But like, it's just a difference of what you do with that kind of like tension or contradiction. Do you try to do something with it, or are you just going to be like, Paul's contradictory? Or you're going to try to kind of like nip and tuck certain words, phrases, all of that, and try to make it work for yourself, to make yourself feel a little better going through it. But yeah, I think that's where I would start with that. In terms of like, how did we get it wrong for 2,000 years? Well, some people started to get it in the modern period. It wasn't just Douglas. But I do think there's something with the church itself here. So some of the way that this gets talked about is like, how did the church get it so wrong, right? For so long, which is part of what you were asking, I believe.
Yeah.
Well, the church gets stuff wrong all the time. Think about the place of women in both family structures and also in ecclesial leadership, right? People. Think about race. Like, think about all this stuff that like the church has gotten wrong. Slavery. Think about all this stuff. The church gets stuff wrong all the time. So this is not surprising to me. So like, what Doug was doing in Deliverance and what we're trying to do is effectively some kind of like historical critical retrieval of or reconstruction of something from the past, from ancient literature, that doesn't need to be beholden to like church traditions. In fact, I don't think it should be. I actually don't. I made a video on I actually didn't even talk about my YouTube channel. I have a YouTube channel called Apocalypse here. I do talk about like the relationship between theology and historical critical research, right? I think historical criticism is a very useful tool to correct stuff that has gone wrong within the church's reconstruction or received expectations about how texts in the Bible work. It can be a tool to correct, is what I'm saying. So novelty, or like something that seems new, right? That's just going to happen. That happens all the time. And I think that's actually a really good thing. It shows, I don't know, like the inexhaustible depth of the Bible, which I think most Christians should be interested in. We shouldn't just be satisfied with like stuff we've heard about the Bible and just trying to repeat that to other people. That doesn't make any sense to me. The point of doing biblical scholarship and reading the Bible in a way that is like careful and actually interested in understanding what's actually going on in those texts, I just think that's a good thing. It's not just for the sake of finding something new. It's not for the sake of novelty, right? It's trying to better grasp what these ancient texts are actually doing. I think people know this. I think even the people who critique in this way know this. Because scholars who tend to bring up the objection to the rhetorical rereading that Douglas and I propose themselves actually introduce novel things in their own interpretations. They do it all the time. The charge comes up against people like us because they just don't like the proposals. They undermine certain scriptural and theological foundations that they have built a lot of their theological thinking on top of. I I think people know this. I just think it's different when it comes to this topic because Romans 1 to 3 underlies so much stuff about Christian theology and Christian understandings of what actually the gospel is all about. So you're taking something away from them, or it seems like that. But I think people know better. I'm thinking of one person in particular, but I won't name names now.
And like
Um,
one of the things I say is like, oh, can you think of another time in which there was a huge amount of theological development rapidly after a massive seismic shift in the Christian tradition, perhaps sometime in the 1500s? Did perhaps new ways of reading the Bible and new doctrines become
huh.
introduced at this point in an attempt to do theological retrieval from what is perceived to be
Yeah.
a an airing of the church?
Yeah.
um, did you know? It's sort of like this critique coming from Protestants feels a bit
It's
rich.
but
Um,
it just does come from Protestants. It's like
yeah,
they're the sort of
yeah,
safeguards of this tradition that they don't really understand. They also don't.
yeah,
Their readings don't actually align with most of what the Christian tradition does with Paul. It just doesn't.
yeah.
It doesn't.
And I would even go so far as to say, well, you can't find like the exact sort of Campbell reading of the reading Paul against himself as he is representing a different person's views. You can't find that throughout church history,
No.
but that's
Yeah.
not a huge part. Like that's not everything in Campbell's work, right? There's still a lot of what he's doing
Yeah.
that you can find all throughout church history, right? Like the part that isn't concordant is this one particular reading of rhetorical framing of certain sections of text. The rest of it, I would say, you like he uses Irenaeus, he uses
Yeah. Yeah.
lots of other people throughout church history to talk about these types of things. And so I would say even that it's like, okay, look, what he's doing isn't super unique. Like sure there are parts of it that are new and novel, but you know what else was new and novel? When we figured out the ending of Mark probably
Yeah.
wasn't there in the
Totally.
original texts. That was pretty new and novel, if you ask me. Like that,
Yeah.
but what we're doing there when we discovered that part is we went, oh, look, we have all these ancient texts. And
Yeah.
while we thought that this part was in the earliest texts, we have pretty good reason to suspect it's not now
Yeah.
because our earliest manuscripts don't actually have this portion in it.
Absolutely.
And so you look at something like that and you go, okay, so we can correct for historical criticism within our theology because now no one really reads the long ending of Mark and goes, this is theologically binding and something that we should read the rest of scripture through, right?
Right.
They read it and they go, neat, cool, glad that's
Yeah.
there, moving on. Right?
Yeah.
And so, and even like when you read early church fathers, for example, a lot of them are themselves doing historical critical analysis, like especially when the canon itself hadn't been formed, and
Yeah.
they're either
Totally.
pulling from documents that aren't
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
canon or excluding other documents that are now in the canon, like
Yeah.
saying,
Yeah.
well, these aren't Paul's letters, but these ones are, and they're basically doing like it's not the same form of critical historical analysis, but their judgment for which books are in and which books are out, or which parts are authoritative and which aren't, are often based on a sort of logic of historicity or logic of historical criticism, I would say.
Yeah.
So like this,
I agree.
I'm a Doug Campbell defender in this, right? I think this is a completely normal and coherent part of the Christian tradition and a normal and coherent way to read the texts. And like this is, I mean, I think of it in sort of like Bayesian reasoning where we update our priors based on new information. And there's been a lot of new information. And that's something that I wanted to talk about. So, one of the claims you make that most people find controversial
Mhm.
is that Romans 1 to 3 part. Do you want to explain for the audience what I'm talking about when I say the Romans 1 to 3 part?
Sure. I mean, simply put, we think that what's going on in Romans 1 to 3, so part of this is we got to think contingently and very precisely in terms of historical details. So I think, and Doug thinks, that Galatians, Philippians, and Romans are written around the same time, really close to each other. And there seems to be the same kind of third party in view. You get this very obviously in Galatians, right? So Paul's really pissed off about this other group of people trying to come in and preach a different gospel. The way he characterizes it is in terms of a gospel. In what I mean by that, it's a presentation of the good news that has something to do for these other people with observing the Torah, in addition to Jesus, responding to Jesus, having faith in or faith of Christ, however you want to talk about that. We talk about that in the book if you want to read about that a bit more. But so it's this other gospel that these other people are kind of coming through, as Lou Martin would call them, the teachers coming through, talking about the gospel in terms of being justified by works of Torah, works of law, ergonamu. And Paul's gospel is about being justified or delivered, set free, however you want to translate that. I don't really care at this point. Whatever you want to do with that term, through the faithfulness or through faith in Christ. So the people he's unhappy with, they're talking about this stuff in terms of being saved by things that you do. Paul's like, no, absolutely not. That's not how this works. He's very clear with his Galatian communities that's not how you get saved. Haven't I told you this? Who's bewitched you, right? As he says, this is not how you become a child of Abraham at all. This is not, especially for pagans, Gentiles. That's who he's concerned about. He's an apostle to the pagans. And it seems like these other agitators, as Lou Martin would call them, these agitators are coming along saying, in order to be a child of Abraham, you Gentiles need to observe the Torah. So that's kind of the basic picture of this group of people that Paul's unhappy with. And you get glimpses of this in Philippians as well. You get a hint of this at the end of Romans, similar to actually what happens in Philippians. But then the beginning of Romans 1:18 and then stretching into 32 is a bit weird in relation to what comes before it and what comes after it. Okay? So we're thinking that these letters are around the same time. Okay. What's going on here? There's a sense in this text that there's some kind of rough patch happening here. What do we do with it? Just starting off like hypothetically, what if the person talking or being depicted as talking in Romans 1:18 to 32 are exactly the folks that Paul's unhappy with, those agitators? What if he's actually putting that in their mouths and presenting this in a way that his community that he has not met yet at Rome, what if he's setting that up and showing them just enough information for them to be like, okay, I can recognize this. If they come through the door saying this stuff, I can know why not to listen to them. And then he goes on through 2:1 to the end of 2:3 as well with the kind of dialogue. It's not a diatribe. That's not a real, actual ancient convention. So I kind of refrain from talking about it as a diatribe, even though a lot of modern scholars do. You have that dialogue in 3, extending through. What if Paul's actually just presenting these other people and saying, here's what they think. Now I'm going to show you why it doesn't work. Now I'm going to show you why it doesn't work specifically as a missionary project for converting Gentiles in particular. Here's why it just simply devolves into absurdity. And then he has a kind of like conversation with that person, which is himself at that point, right? So I'm not saying that like, this is where I think people misunderstand this approach. I don't think that like another guy is writing stuff and then Paul comes in and writes more stuff. We're like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that Paul is representing or presenting, characterizing somebody else in this particular way, and then showing how that kind of devolves into absurdity at that point.
Yeah.
So I think that's
I
the move that we make.
I always found this reading of Romans to be particularly satisfying because, I mean, for most people who read Romans 1 to 3, it does read very odd. Like, it starts
Yeah.
off with Paul saying one thing and then immediately saying, hold the phone, everyone.
Yeah.
And then it kind of goes back and forth. Like, you therefore are without excuse after he
Yeah.
just
So
gets talking about the
exactly, it
depravity
starts
and
off
things like
like
that.
right before 118. It's like it's talking about the deliverance of God being revealed from faith to faith, however you want to translate that.
Yeah.
It depends on. It's actually a very difficult text in the Greek, but something like that. The righteous one through faith will live, and then it's like, therefore, the wrath of God. And it's like, wait,
Yeah.
hang on a minute. That seems like a weird shift, but yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, and so the basic proposal for Romans 1 to 3 is it is a sort of extended rhetorical tool. Often the fancy word for it is prosopopoia, which just means speech and character, right?
Yes.
So Paul is not speaking as himself, he is speaking as his opponent so that he can then in different parts throughout 1 to 3, it's the opponent speaking and then Paul showing why that thing that the opponent just said doesn't really work, and then sort of alternating back and forth. And yeah, so I remember when I read this back in 2014, people were like, very cool story, Doug, but does this exist in any other letter, or did you just like make this up for Romans? How would you like is does this exist anywhere else, or is this just a special thing for Romans?
It's not a special thing for Romans, which is amazing. It's an amazing thing. So what I'll we're gonna camp out here for a little bit, so just let me cook for a bit.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
So one of my dear friends, Andrew Rilera, who is up at the King's University in Edmonton.
And who has endorsed some episodes of this podcast, by the
Hell
way.
yeah. I love it. So he wrote a dissertation called Paul's Philonic Opponent, where he does extensive primary source research on this stuff. More than anybody to date. Anybody from ancient Greek texts. But I do want to start with some context here. A lot of scholars agree that Paul does this sort of rhetorical stuff in First Corinthians, like in quite a lot of places. He'll quote from what the Corinthians, or basically positions, potential positions that like the Corinthians may have been influenced by. And scholars refer to this as a Corinthian slogan, where Paul will sort of set up this stuff. And what's interesting about these, when Paul is setting up another voice or someone he's actually kind of trying to respond to, he doesn't use like what Andrew calls verbs of saying. And then someone says this, then I say this, which is what we would want as English speaking people, right? Those verbs don't occur in those places, but scholars are still able to recognize that something's off in those texts. It doesn't read cleanly from front to back as Paul is sort of endorsing stuff. Those verbs don't just occur in those places. But scholars still understand that something weird is going on. There's too much of a contradiction there between what's just been said and what's actually being said afterward. And so they're like, well, what if Paul's quoting somebody else at that point? And then going on to kind of respond and object to it and argue against it. People do this all the time in the Corinthian correspondence. So scholars who have actually picked up on this stuff haven't done the primary source research. Why do they do this? Because it's actually intuitive when they pick it up. It's actually fairly cross-cultural. Like we can pick up where like the thread of a text, there's like a kind of rough bit there. I'm trying to think of a good example, like stand-up comedy. Stand-up comics do this all the time. They're speaking in the voice of somebody else. And like you can pick up as someone who is a fan of a certain stand-up comedian, you can be like, oh, they're not actually being sincere here. They're setting somebody else up, and then they're going to go on and respond to it. I understand the state of comedy at this point is a bit dire for right-wing comedy in particular, but so they change. But what they do is they change their voice and inflection, and during those times when they're actually setting somebody else up, right?
And sometimes when they're an autistic podcaster, they forget to change their voice and inflection and confuse their audience. I've got several emails about this. I do this quite frequently in the podcast when I'm talking about positions that I don't hold.
Yeah.
And I try to do my best job at steel manning them and explaining why people hold these positions. And then I go on to explain that this is not, there are issues here.
Totally.
But
I totally understand that for sure. So, but like this sort of performance was actually expected with epistles in particular. There's a performative dimension to like epistles are not things that you pick up and read. You perform them. It's a written speech, right? So we forget the performative dimension of these texts a lot of the time because we're so used to like having the Bible read to us or like picking up a text and reading it. That's not how it worked in the ancient world. It just wasn't. They didn't have Bibles. They didn't have their own personal scrolls. That didn't exist at that point. So that's kind of the main way into this kind of situation. And even think about like, let's say Romans with Phoebe coming in, carrying the letter. She performs it first at Corinth, I think, and then at Rome. And if people didn't get it, what are they going to do? They can ask her. She's right there. They can be like, hey, I didn't understand this certain part of this letter. She can be like, okay, let me try it this way. Maybe you can understand it this way. There could have been adjustments at that point. It's also not clear that she would have just performed it once at Rome. We don't really know. But like that accessibility between the letter bearer, performer, and also the community was actually quite close. That's a really important thing. Because like, even if people didn't pick up themselves the cues that are actually in the text, they can just be like, hey, I don't understand what you're saying. And she can be like, okay, here's a different way to think about this. Maybe I can try and explain it differently. So a lot of stuff in this is going to be audible and even visual cues, vocal inflection, intonation, physical acting, likely within this stuff. But here's the thing. Within the ancient world, before Paul's time, after Paul's time, during Paul's time, ancient people learned how to evaluate rhetorical texts from the age, like an elementary school age, really, to like a college age kind of person. Obviously, they didn't have elementary and college, but you do have handbooks, school manuals from like elementary school. The Progymnasma, which is like a very basic rhetorical manual for like effectively like 5 through 8-year-olds that are teaching you how to identify certain speakers within a text and how to know when someone is speaking, when you don't have verbs of saying, you don't have any of that. You're trained to know how to do this all the way up to like college level stuff, basically more sophisticated ways of doing this in those rhetorical handbooks. So ancient Greek speakers actually learned how to use these skills in their own speeches because you were expected to do that, and in their reading and interpretation of performed speeches in front of them. Okay. What's hard for us as modern people to realize is just how public and active reading was. It was just out, like, you could literally watch someone do this. So in order for an audience you need to learn how to inflect. In order to actually perform this well to an audience, you actually need to learn how to inflect and perform in a certain kind of way, which you're trained to do. So what I mean is that scholars without all of that primary source information intuitively encounter contradictions in texts and go, okay, maybe I'm encountering something that is not some wildly inconsistent, like stupid speaker. Maybe what I'm encountering is two sides of a debate. They learn how to do this. Okay. I mean, you see this in Lucy Peppiatt's work on 1 Corinthians 11. She does this straight through. She's picking up on Doug's kind of stuff in Deliverance, actually. So if listeners are interested in that, go check out that book. It's Women and Worship in Corinth is that book. The reason I bring that up is because her book has landed well with certain scholars who are convinced by her scripting of it. Not just in this book, but in some of her other books. Why does this matter to me? Well, they haven't actually brought on board Doug's reading for whatever reason, even though it's interesting to me. Sorry. It's interesting to me. But it matters to me because there are no verbs of saying in those texts that Lucy Peppiatt is actually talking about. There's no you say this, but I say this stuff. But there are other signals within that text that are actually quite overt that suggest that a debate is going on. So the way that Peppiatt actually scripts 1 Corinthians 11 is basically that we have two gar transitions. So gar just means in Greek 4, right? 4, not the number 4, but FOR. From basically what the Corinthians are saying to what Paul is actually saying, then back to them. So a lot of scholars are totally cool with, Peppiatt's rhetorical kind of scripting here in Paul's use of gar as indicating a kind of shift, but get really upset when we're trying to do some of the same sorts of things in Romans. I don't understand it. That's fine. Whatever. I could talk hours about that and why Romans is kind of off the table. I talked a bit about it, but I think it just has to do with like this sort of golden calf that we have around Romans 1-3 in particular for a lot of people. But when we come to Romans, so 1:18, we've got the gar transition. Therefore, the wrath of God. Right? Just like people identified in 1 Corinthians 11, which can indicate a new speaker. It can do that. It's fairly unstable, though. We need something else, I think. But I think we can show a somewhat stronger indication that a speech and character is going on. So, Romans 2, how does that start off?
Yeah, it starts with you therefore have no excuse, oh man.
You
When you
have no excuse. So, 2:1 is in ancient rhetorical terms, it's an apostrophe, a turn away from something. This is how it's actually used. It's a dia. Therefore, for. Very similar to gar. But dia gets used as an apostrophe, a turn away from something to address someone or something else. Okay? So Paul's addressing someone else here. He's identifying this somebody else, you, oh man, and he's characterizing them in a certain way. He's addressing someone and characterizing them as a judger, not just in general, but of people who do specific things in that text. So we have an address, we have a characterization, and right at the beginning of the sentence, we have the dia, which is the therefore, this sort of apostrophe that happens there. For this reason, depends on how you want to translate it. Now, if we step back for a second and look at ancient sources like the Rhetorica Editor, look at Quintilian, or elementary rhetorical texts like, as I was saying, the Progymnosmata, which is Theon. You can look at Pseudo-Hermogenes. You can look at all sorts of things. These span centuries, really. So the conventions of rhetorical use of these, of like actual texts, like speaking, that have speech and character kind of within them, it's very stable. It's very consistent throughout. Okay. So this predates Paul, as I was saying. It postdates Paul. It's very stable. It's a very like clear convention within Greco-Roman literature. So, according to this kind of broad range of material, here's what needs to happen if you were a student or someone learning how to write or perform in this specific way. How do you know that speech and character is happening? Another speaker needs to be identified. Another speaker needs to be characterized as a hero, a philosopher, a teacher, a fool, a judger. What do you know? And all of the attributed speech to that interlocutor needs to be appropriate to that character. Okay? Now, the reason this convention happens is because there's no formal or standardized arrangement of verbs of saying, as I was talking about. There's no standardized like I say this, you say this. That doesn't happen. It can happen. It's not standardized though. It can happen, and it happens in Epictetus. It happens sometimes in Philo. It happens sometimes in Josephus. But in those same texts, you still have verbless transitions from one speaker to another, and then go on to show that how that dialogue is actually going all the way through. A good classic example of this, I'm sorry I'm talking so long.
Keep going. This is great.
Is we have grammarians who were basically ancient Greek philologists, textual scholars, essentially, who were commenting on Homer's works, which of course predates Paul by several hundred years, right? These commenters kind of brought together what were called scholios. So Homeric scholios were a collection of manuscripts of Homer, and the grammarians had marginal notes, right? So they'll note when these verbless transitions happen, how to find out which speaker is actually speaking. For example, is this Homer or is this some other character? So they're actually kind of like doing it in the margins for you. So even these folks were doing it. They didn't have verbs of saying. They just kind of figured out how to do this sort of stuff. This is well before Paul. So what happens is this gets kind of codified into what Porphyry calls, I think he was early 4th century Porphyry. I think he calls this the solution from the character. So what he's saying is, whenever you find contradictions in a given text, or can sense some kind of like a rough patch in it, right? That kind of disrupts the logic of a text or a given speech, right? Or sense some kind of different voice. He calls that diaphonia, which is really dissonance, is what that term means. You need to discern this in the solution, the character of what's consistent with which character. So what is consistent with which kind of speaker, which kind of part of the rough patch that we're talking about. So that's how you should solve diaphonia, dissonance. That's how you should solve it. Which speech is appropriate to which character? So when you encounter something like diaphonia, you need to go with what Andrew Valera calls the criteria of appropriateness. What is appropriate to which character? So whose character fits X the best? The author's own voice, according to their own commitments, or some other voice that's in the room. Which one fits the bill? I can go on and on. But what I'll say is, if we think about Romans 2:1 in particular, because I think this is actually where we need to go, Romans 2:1, to figure out what's appropriate for which speaker. We realize that in 2:1, that whoever is talking in 2:1 is characterizing a speaker as a judger who judges people for doing certain things, as we talked about, leaves themselves out of the orbit of indictment. That person he's talking about. Realize that the one speaking in Romans 1:18 through 32 is a dead ringer for this character in terms of the criteria of appropriateness. The one speaking there is a judger and judges people for doing certain things. The one speaking there is Paul's interlocutor, I think. not Paul himself. Paul himself comes in 2:1 with an apostrophe, or a capping formula is another way that it's talked about. So the combination of the ancient sources that stretch back before Paul, during Paul, after him, that verbless transition, introduction really into 118, in concert with that kind of apostrophe in 2:1, or capping formula, however you want to talk about it. The fact that Paul does this very same thing, this very similar thing in his corpus elsewhere, and all of this other stuff from external sources, the fact that this stuff is happening all over the place, I think that's a good reason, it's good precedent to think that what's going on is Paul is setting someone else up. I just think that's got to be the best kind of way of doing this. Thank God for Andrew Rillera for finding all of this stuff in the primary sources. Like, it's just insanely ubiquitous is what I would say. It just is ubiquitous. And people have missed it. So there's also so much more evidence too that could take hours to go through. But that's what I would say as a kind of long / not long enough explanation of this. But I hope this is helpful.
Yeah. I think it is. And I also think that's like, for those who aren't aware, Romans 1:18 through 32 is a somewhat controversial section of the Bible for many people. This is famously one of the places where you get what are called the clobber passages. This is one of them. For those unaware, this is one of the sort of very harsh condemnations of homosexuality, if that's anachronistic to even call it homosexuality, but it's used in anti-gay polemics. And one of the things you're suggesting is this might not actually be Paul, like Paul's actual opinions. This is Paul expressing the opinions of someone else, and then immediately in the next one showing, hey, you are taking this standard. So like Romans 1:18 through 32 is basically saying God's wrath is going to be turned on all of you because you knew what was right in your heart. The law of God was, you knew it. And thinking yourself wise, you became fools and exchanged the glory of the eternal God for created things. And the examples he gives for this depravity is men exchanged unnatural relations with men, and women exchanged unnatural relations with each other. And what you're suggesting here is Paul is saying, this is the type of thing that they come in here saying to you. This is the type of thing that you're hearing from these false teachers that are messing with my project here. And you need to understand that when they say this, they are casting judgment on you, but also condemning themselves.
Yeah, that's right.
and so this doesn't actually work for them either.
No,
and it's one of those things where you can read it through. And I remember first reading it through, and someone on the internet had gone through Deliverance and just highlighted Romans with Douglas's or with Doug's, suggested this is probably what Paul is saying. This is probably what his interlocutor was supposed to have said. And I just remember going through reading and being like, wow, that actually works pretty well.
It makes beautiful
like,
sense of the text. Like,
yes,
just simply reading it straight through. Yeah.
It reads coherently straight through. Like, it doesn't, you don't get to a point and you're like, I don't really know what's going on here. Like, it does work rhetorically. And when you point out that there's actually an enormous amount of really good precedent for this, like, this isn't a novel thing that only happens in Romans. This is like when you turn on the Colbert Report was a while ago, but like you turn on the TV and you find like Stephen Colbert pretending to be Bill O'Reilly.
That Stephen Colbert for sure.
Yes. Yeah. Same. He's pretending to be like a right-wing political pundit, and you turn that on, and in your cultural context, you understand that this is a joke. You understand that when he's talking, like, this is meant to be sort of making fun of the political opponents, not supporting them, even though he's talking in their voice. And often in the Colbert Show, he himself, after he says something, will then say another thing that directly contradicts it to let you in on the
Yes,
whole
that's
joke,
right.
right?
That's right.
And that's sort of what you're suggesting is going on in here. And then you're saying, if we read Romans 1 through 3 like it harmonizes with the rest of Paul's writing.
Absolutely.
This
It
sort
does.
of 10% that we've been reading 90% of Paul through, it actually turns into, well, this part is actually harmonious with everything. It turns into a situation in which this isn't really a lens through which we're viewing everything. This is sort of just an introductory thing
Yeah.
that flows into the sort of heartlands of Paul,
Yeah.
which is in the sort of mid to late mid section of Romans.
Yeah.
And also in that middle and late middle section of Romans, like in 4 through 9, you get a very different accounting of the gospel. Like you don't get natural theology, or you don't get natural law
Yeah.
like you get in 118 through 32. You don't get everyone is condemned under the law because of this. You get a message of, just as death entered the world through one man, so life enters the world through the same way. I messed up that quote, but like and you get all sorts of like very, I mean, a lot of universalists get a lot out of those chapters for a reason, right? Because it uses very universal language. It uses very it uses language that is not exactly harmonious with 1 through 3. and
Yeah.
and this is suggesting, actually, the way that this is completely harmonious is through understanding 1 through 3 as a sort of extended rhetorical strategy being used by Paul to using the conventions of his day and using the understandings of his day to communicate this. Another thing that I like to point out when people push back on me is they're like, well, why don't any of the church fathers recognize this rhetoric? And it's like, we don't actually know what they were writing on Romans 1 through 3 for the most part, because most of them aren't writing like detailed commentaries until a couple hundred years later, when doctrine is already pretty established. Like the first
100%.
time you start getting detailed commentaries on Romans is like in the 3rd or 4th century. Like, it's a while removed after theology has already started to become more crystallized, and the ways of understanding these things, and the concerns that they're having change very significantly, because they're now trying to deal with Gnosticism popping up in
Sure.
their
Yeah.
and whatnot. And their concern is not necessarily like, how are we supposed to be dealing with Romans, but how are we supposed to be dealing with this group of people who says, well, actually the gospel means something completely different, and it has to do with archons and
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
like that, right?
Yeah.
And that is the context in which you get the church fathers first writing detailed commentaries on this. So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
reality is, we don't really know what they thought about this for as long as we'd like to think we knew. And by the time they started writing it, the context in which this sort of contingent writing was written is gone.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Also, just to pick up on that quickly, is they also didn't have Bibles.
Yep. That's also
It's
crucial.
not like they can just go sit down
Yeah.
and read Romans themselves. Usually, I mean, it's possible that you could get
Yeah.
a copy of a text, but that would have to be
Maybe some partial codexes floating around somewhere.
it costs a lot of money at that time to actually have that commissioned. Basically, it's like a painting, right?
Yeah.
You have to get it commissioned essentially at that point to actually get some sort of physical copy of this stuff. So they're not like they can just pick up Romans and just read it themselves. Usually, that's just not how it worked in the early centuries. Also, at the same time, somebody like just Origin, for example, he doesn't read Romans 1 to 3 like a justification theorist. He does some
No.
funky stuff with it.
I mean, he does
He
some
really
funky
does.
stuff with lots of texts.
Yeah, which is cool. I love.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a huge fan of Origin in a lot of ways. I disagree with them on some stuff, but he doesn't read it like what people assume is the traditional quote unquote reading of Romans 1 to 3. These guys are not doing that early on.
Yeah.
They're just not. They're
Yep.
doing something else with it. They're
And
not picking up on the rhetorical move, obviously.
yeah.
I wonder why, if it has something to do with the performative dimension of these texts. I wonder. Um, they also didn't, likely at that point. I don't think they were actually trying to compare what Paul or anyone in the Bible is doing with like certain rhetorical handbooks at that time, right? Like,
Yeah.
why would they have other concerns at that point, like
Yep.
you were saying? So it's no
And
wonder that they didn't see this at that time. Like, it makes so much sense why they wouldn't. But yeah,
and
I
like
hear that
a
all the
lot of
time.
these guys are also like Neoplatonists who are
Yeah,
bringing
totally.
their own
So
Neoplatonist
absolutely,
ideals into how
absolutely,
texts work and what
yes,
texts reveal and what texts are supposed to reveal.
absolutely right.
I
Absolutely.
myself am not much of a Neoplatonist, but it is
Neither am I.
undeniable that
Yeah.
Neoplatonist assumptions are sort of rife within the early church fathers. And when you have Neoplatonist assumptions, that implies things about, perfection and ideal
Yes.
forms and things like that. And so
Absolutely.
those assumptions get brought into holy text. And so why would they be looking for rhetoric when they are coming into a text with a whole other set of preconceived notions about what texts and perfection and things like that should be, right?
100%. I put out a video a few days ago on hermeneutics, and I talked about scripts that we bring to text. We all do it, right? So, like,
Yeah.
as you were saying, ancient people, early kind of church figures, were bringing to text certain concerns that they were already dealing with. And so they read the text in the light of those preconceived kind of concerns. Those scripts are actually doing a lot of the work for them, which is, again, fine. We all do it. But we need to be aware and honest about what we're doing when we're bringing certain scripts to certain texts. It's not even text, it's just everyday things. That's the only way we can interpret data. If we didn't have scripts coming to a certain data set, we would just be overwhelmed by data, raw data. Like, we
Yeah.
couldn't actually be able to understand it. It would just overwhelm us. There's no way to do it, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, scripts are important, but like we have to be attentive to like which scripts people are bringing to different texts. You're right about the early church. They're dealing with their own stuff for the most part. At the same time, they're also dealing with these scripts that have been given to them by kind of Neoplatonist assumptions about text themselves, what that even means in the first place, how to extract meaning from something. It's so complicated at that point.
Yeah.
So, like, it's no wonder that the rhetorical stuff was not at the top of their mind. No, literally no wonder why that wasn't a concern for them. So, yeah.
Yeah. I recently tweeted out some random thoughts. I was just saying, I think most people would be very disappointed to learn that the early church probably cared far more about things that mattered to them and not things that mattered to us.
Yeah,
and,
totally.
and like I put like a copy pasta green text on the bottom being like, goes back in time. Oh, finally, I can learn about what the true church was supposed to be. Go to the nearest church, find the leader. It's a girl. Gross. That's what really matters to Christians. 4-hour spur grant about how much she hates the cult of Artemis.
Yeah.
And like literally, that's what you're going to get when you're going to ancient
That's right.
texts. And
That's right.
it's not going to be what you care about, or like, again,
No.
asking questions about like, well, which side of this 16th century justification debate do you fall under? It's like, buddy, I don't care. Like
Yeah.
this is not the concern that we have at this time. Like
Yep.
we're at each other's throats about whether we're supposed to be eating meat sacrificed to idols. Like
Yeah, exactly.
that's what's really
Yeah.
going on here.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah, so I think that's a good place to cap that off.
Sounds good.
Do you have anything else you wanted to add,
No, I
or
do
any
want to
topics we
say
didn't cover?
no. The only thing I want to say is, first of all, thank you for having me on this
Yeah, it's been
podcast.
great.
Second, one thing I failed to mention at the beginning with the kind of pitch for this book is I really want. I mean, this might be just a selfish thing on my part. I really hope that people read this book and get in touch with what I think is the heart of what God is really all about, which is a God of unconditional love. This God loves you so much that God is never, ever going to give up on you, ever. That is what I want people to get in touch with. If people can get that stuff up front, if that's the message that people take away from this book, even if they disagree with the sort of rhetorical rereading, okay? Even if they disagree with that, I hope people come away from the book with a deeper sense of God's love for them in Jesus Christ. That's what I care about the most. That's, I think, what I'm here for as a human being is trying to witness to that truth claim. That's really what I care about the most. So you can read the book and disagree with the rhetorical rereading. Fine. I just hope people move closer, especially in where Christianity is now, especially in the United States. I just want people to get in touch with that and let that wash over them and realize that this is the sort of God that is holding you together. That's what I
Would you
care about.
perhaps say, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall
Yeah,
trouble or
yeah.
hardship?"
Good Romans 8 move. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I care
So
about.
it's been great having you on the podcast. I would highly recommend, if you are interested in this, John's channel is called Apocalypse Here, and the tagline is Christianity You Can Live With. And that is often what I'm trying to sell to my audience is just like, look,
You do a
I'm
great
I'm
job.
not I'm not trying to give you the Christianity. I'm giving one that you can tolerate, and one
Yes.
where the cognitive dissonance load is low enough that you can actually
Yep.
live with it.
Yep.
And anyway, I think your channel does a great job in attempting to accomplish that mission for a subset of
Thank
people.
you.
I know they do because I send them to your channel quite a few times, and they're like, "Oh, this is great. I love this." If you're interested in discussions of scholarship and theology and more like thinking and dealing with theology, especially I would say if you're coming from a more left progressive way and you're trying to figure out like how do I think of Christianity now, especially in my current context with all the baggage that I have dragged along with it, I would recommend you check out John's channel. There's a lot of good stuff on there and a lot of good discussions. Anywhere else they can find you?
No, I'm actually pretty much off social media at this point.
Cool. That's probably
So
for the best.
it is. Yeah, it's been good to get off of that stuff. But
Yep.
yeah.
Cool. My name is John. You can find me on Twitter, or X, formerly known as Twitter, at Christianity On. You can find me on Blue Sky at christianityon.bluesky.social. You can find me by email at christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com. You can also find me in the Christianity on the Spectrum Discord, where we talk about many things. You can just email me or message me on one of the social medias for the link, and I'll send it to you, and you can join and talk about many of the fascinating subjects that we talk about, including this book comes up quite a bit. Well, at least Douglas Campbell does. We have a few Campbell heads in the Discord. We also just finished a book club on Andrew Rilea's book Lamb of the Free. So if that stuff is interesting to you, you can Check that out. Also, we are currently running a fundraiser for the Against Malaria Foundation. If you would like to support this podcast financially or help motivate me to continue making podcasts, please consider donating to the Against Malaria Foundation. It genuinely does help and motivate me. We've raised over $1,300 so far, which is wild. We are inching closer to, statistically speaking, saving the life of one child, which is pretty cool to me. We have already prevented, statistically speaking, many cases of malaria, and malaria is very bad. So donate to the fundraiser. Let's get more bed nets. You could also buy our merch. The proceeds will be donated to the Against Malaria Foundation as well and shared with the artists. So if you would like a sticker declaring your love for the Acts of Paul and Thecla fan fiction, where Paul is a gender studies professor and teaches Thecla feminism, we've got a sticker for you. If you want a sticker that shows that you are religious, not spiritual, or that it's not a relationship, it's a religion, or to express you have complicated feelings about the Council of Chalcedon, we've got you covered. Check it out. I'll put a link in the description as well. All right, that's it for me. See y'all later.